In this video, the 6 most expensive countries in Latin America. Latin America is known for being a region with a very low cost of living. Now, these 6 countries are the exception. They're still going to be cheaper than Canada and the United States for the most part, but in any region, there's going to be cheaper countries and there's going to be more expensive countries. So in this video, we're going to be breaking down the 6 most expensive countries in Latin America. And as always, we're going to be going from north to south. It's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly what's the most expensive country. Kind of depends on your lifestyle. So we're just going to hit you with generally the most expensive ones going from north to south. The first country on our list is Mexico. Prices and cost of living have risen dramatically in Mexico over the past couple of years. This is largely due to the influx of tourists and gringos, but it's also an equal part due to the rising peso. The Mexican peso has risen quite a lot. It's kind of reached a steady state at around 17 pesos per US dollar. We used to be able to get 20 pesos per US dollar, and now at 17, expats are starting to feel the bite a little bit more. Now, I would say as a Mexico advocate that you can still live cheaply in Mexico. You can still live on less than $1,000 a month, and even less than that if you really want to. But the big cities are getting a lot more expensive. There's no denying that. Mexico City, people are paying absurd rent prices in Mexico City to be in the best neighborhoods. Monterrey is also very expensive. Guadalajara is getting more expensive. The Baja Peninsula is quite expensive. Tulum is famously ridiculously overpriced. So there are very expensive pockets within the country of Mexico. Certainly, because it's such a big country, you can go to cheaper places as well. Now, if you looked at a chart of the list of Mexican states by GDP, you would be able to determine that some states in Mexico have much higher GDP than others. The general trend is that the northern part of the country has higher GDP and therefore higher cost of living, while the southern part of the country has a much lower GDP and lower cost of living. So if you want to live cheaper in Mexico, you can look at places like Oaxaca, Chiapas, Veracruz, Tabasco, Campeche, states like that in the south. But yeah, Mexico, pretty expensive. I think a lot of expats are actually surprised at how expensive it is. Certainly still way cheaper than the US, and by moving to Mexico from the US, you'll probably reduce your costs by on average about 50%, if not more, especially when you include the fact that you're not going to need to own a car. But all that to say that Mexico probably does deserve its spot on the top 6 most expensive countries in Latin America. The next country on our list is El Salvador. El Salvador uses the US dollar. The US dollar is the official currency in El Salvador, which tends to contribute to a higher cost of living. Countries that use the US dollar tend to have a slightly higher cost of living than countries that have their own currency. So people report generally that El Salvador is cheaper than Costa Rica, but significantly more expensive than Nicaragua. So you could probably put it roughly on par with Panama, but things are changing rapidly in El Salvador. This could be for better or for worse. I would probably say for better because, as we know, with the new president, Bukele, they have recently routed out a lot of the crime and the corruption in the country, and that should allow the country to work more efficiently and the markets to work more efficiently, and so therefore all that good stuff. So a more efficient and functional and organized economy should lead to a lower cost of living. Obviously, that's kind of balanced against the fact that tons of expats are moving to El Salvador, tons of crypto millionaires and this kind of thing as well. But I think overall, prices in prices in El Salvador should stay flat or even fall with time. Rent might be an exception, and rent is obviously the biggest variable, but you could probably expect food prices and a lot of other day-to-day expenses in El Salvador to fall, or at very least get more value for your money. The next country on our list is Costa Rica. Costa Rica is probably the most expensive country in Latin America. We get lots of people telling us on Twitter that, they just got back from a trip to Costa Rica and they were surprised at how expensive it was. They were saying that the prices are higher than they're used to in New Jersey, higher than they're used to in Arizona. And yeah, things can be pretty expensive in Costa Rica. Hotels are quite expensive, car rentals are quite expensive. All the touristy activities are going to be much more expensive in Costa Rica compared to, an equivalent tourist experience in, say, Nicaragua, whether that be a tour guide or, visiting a waterfall or visiting a coffee farm or something like that. All these experiences are going to be a little bit more expensive in Costa Rica. I think Costa Rica has been able to ride on their legacy reputation for a long time as being a very safe and gringo-friendly country. And I think what we're experiencing now is that prices are so high in Costa Rica that the locals really aren't able to live well anymore relative to their salaries. And so I think this is contributing to a bit of a rise in crime in Costa Rica, unfortunately. And a lot of people are reporting that Nicaragua is significantly safer than Costa Rica, which is kind of unfortunate. And actually, a lot of gringos are leaving Costa Rica, not so much because of the crime, but actually just because it's so expensive that it's no longer worth it. When prices are higher than the US, it starts changing the calculus, and maybe some people are returning to the US or they're moving to lower cost locales, which might be, Colombia or Mexico or El Salvador, Nicaragua, something like that, right? So Costa Rica, definitely very expensive. A lot of people have sticker shock, and that's something to consider. So if you're planning a trip to Central America, you might want to skip Costa Rica, or at least rethink, do you really need to go to your trip in Costa Rica, or could you maybe go to, say, Nicaragua or Guatemala instead and have a very similar experience and spend, half the amount of money? The next country on our list is Panama. Panama also uses the US dollar, which contributes to the high cost of living in the country. Panama also has one of the highest GDPs, if not the highest GDP in Latin America. So obviously the cost of living is going to be a little bit higher because salaries are quite high there. It's a country of only around 4 million people, and there's actually a lot of blocked professions in Panama, whether that be lawyers or doctors, and even up to retail employees and things like that. And so there's a lot less competition in Panama. It's very hard. It's easy to start a business that's online, but it's very hard to start an in-person business in Panama because there's a bit of a lack of, mano de obra, of handymen or talent or just local human capital that you can employ in your business. Panama also has very harsh labor laws as well that are very much in favor of the employee and not of the employer. So these are just some theories I have as to why Panama is quite expensive. I think if they allowed non-Panamanians to practice certain professions, that would lead to lower prices in a lot of industries and a lot of stuff in Panama. You would think Panama would be pretty cheap because it has the canal and therefore all the goods are passing through, and you would think that you'd be able to basically get any good for the same or maybe even less expensive than the United States because, the goods are passing through Panama anyway. But that's not always the case. Panama is not super expensive. It's certainly cheaper than the United States for a lot of things. Healthcare is cheaper. Transportation, Ubers are cheaper. Restaurants are a little bit cheaper. Hotels and accommodations are a little bit cheaper. So it's overall a little bit cheaper than the US. But, by Latin American standards, it's one of the more expensive countries in Latin America. All right, the next country on our list is Chile. Chile is historically known as an expensive country because they have high GDP. It's very organized and civilized and European, but there's really a lack of tourism to Chile for one reason or another. It's very far away. Really, it's not a digital nomad destination. It's not very much of a expat or a retirement destination either. So I think Chile receives a lot less international tourism and a lot less international travelers than other countries in Latin America. And so I have this theory that even though Chile has historically been known as one of the more expensive countries, I think it's actually cheaper than you probably imagine because there's not really that much competition on Airbnb, for the hotels, in the restaurants. There's really not that much international traffic. There's not too many Americans coming down with their credit cards and US dollars and stuff. So I think Chile is actually probably a little bit cheaper than you probably imagine. Maybe you're imagining a country that's the same price as the United States or something like that. But I've had a lot of people report to me that Chile is significantly cheaper than Panama. So that's really saying something. So Chile, definitely a country to look out for. I think it's cheaper than you might expect for travelers. And I think also as, an expat living there might not be as expensive as you might expect because certain things are cheaper in Chile because they have a lot of ports and they face the Pacific Ocean. So they really have direct access from China and Asia. So they have a lot of, Chinese cars and Chinese or Asian appliances, microwaves, all that type of stuff. So really a lot of things like that, whether that be electronics or cars or appliances, are actually cheaper in Chile than they are in Argentina or Brazil, for example. So Chile made the list just because, I don't know, I guess it has to be included in this list of the most expensive countries, but really, I think it's probably cheaper than you might imagine. All right, the sixth and final country on our list is Uruguay. Uruguay is known for being one of the most expensive countries in Latin America. It's a country of only 3 million some odd people, and it's certainly off the beaten track for most travelers, expats, and retirees. It's a country that has historically always been pretty expensive. They have their own currency, the Uruguayan peso. If you are banking there, you can also hold US dollars and many local checking accounts. So it is quite integrated to the international financial system. And I guess as a small plug, we can help people open bank accounts in Uruguay. But yeah, Uruguay is known as a pretty expensive country overall, certainly more expensive than Argentina and more expensive than Brazil as well for most things, right? And you don't have the benefit of having Ciudad del Este in Paraguay or having Chile on the border, right? Because Chile is bordered only by Argentina and by Brazil, and so they don't really have access to the Pacific. They don't have access to some of those cheaper products that might flow in through Paraguay or through Chile. So they don't have direct access to some of that stuff. Montevideo does have a port, so they do, have access to products, but really, Uruguay overall pretty expensive. We've had a previous podcast episode talking with a guy named Foer, F-H-O-E-R. He's a Brazilian Uruguayan, something like that, and he lives on the border between Argentina and Uruguay. I might be getting this wrong, but basically, even though he's in Uruguay, he buys all his products in Argentina. So he buys his gas in Argentina, he buys his food and his shopping in Argentina, and so that's why, even though he's living in Uruguay and has land in Uruguay and all this stuff, he's able to kind of lower his cost basis by doing that. So I think there's some hacks you can do there, but overall, yeah, expensive country. So, concluding our list here, let's run through it one more time from north to south. Mexico, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Panama, Chile, and Uruguay. Those are the 6 most expensive countries in Latin America. If you are seeking a very, very low cost of living in Latin America, maybe you're a digital nomad who's bootstrapping and just getting started. Maybe you're a backpacker and just trying to stretch that money, living off savings. Maybe you're a retiree and you're living off a pension and you want to stretch those pension payments as far as possible and the retirement savings that you have. These are the 6 countries that you probably want to avoid. I think they're still overall cheaper than the United States and Canada by a long shot. But, in the region, there's winners and losers, and these are the 6 most expensive countries. Hope you enjoyed this video. Expect much more on YouTube from My Latin Life in the future, so don't forget to subscribe.